Every human being carries within themselves a story that lasts a lifetime, even if they have never heard it before. Sometimes that story begins long before we are born. Sometimes long before our first conscious choice. The story of Jacob and Esau belongs to those biblical narratives that have become so deeply woven into human culture that we have almost stopped asking what they are truly about. We have grown accustomed to seeing it as a family drama, a story of inheritance, or a religious parable. But perhaps there is another way to read it. Perhaps the ancient authors were telling us more than the story of two brothers. Perhaps they were speaking of two forces that every human being carries within. If so, the events of the book of Genesis gradually cease to be merely the history of one family. They begin to unfold within the landscape of the human psyche. Perhaps this is why the story has endured for thousands of years. Not because it tells us about two brothers, but because, generation after generation, it helps us recognize something of ourselves. So let us read this story as the journey of a human personality coming into being, as though everything that follows is unfolding not somewhere in the distant past, but within the human soul. The ancient narrative begins even before the brothers are born. Rebecca senses that her children are already struggling with one another in her womb. For the ancient world, this was a sign. For analytical psychology, it is an archetypal image. The conflict appears before conscious choice ever exists. In other words, we do not create the opposites within ourselves. We are born with them. The first to emerge is Esau. Scripture draws attention to details that, at first glance, seem almost incidental. He is reddish in appearance, covered with thick hair, a man of the earth, a man of immediate action, a man not yet separated from the raw force of his own nature. Moments later, the second child is born. His hand is grasping his brother's heel. The gesture is so unusual that it becomes his very name. Jacob, the one who holds on to the heel. In the ancient world, a name was rarely accidental. It did not merely identify a person. It pointed toward the direction of an inner destiny. If we look at this episode as the story of the developing psyche, a remarkable pattern begins to emerge. The ego is never born alone. It comes into being alongside that which will eventually become its opposite. Erich Neumann's student, Edward Edinger, observed that similar pairs appear in many cultures: Romulus and Remus, Castor and Pollux. They remind us that the human psyche experiences itself, from the very beginning, as inwardly divided. The story of Jacob and Esau, then, is not about one brother proving superior to the other. It is about two fundamentally different modes of being that appear together and immediately enter into a relationship of tension. What is striking is that the ancient text never rushes to tell us which brother is right. Instead, it offers us a single symbol. One steps forward, the other refuses to release his heel. There is no deception yet, no blessing, no exile. And yet the archetype has already revealed itself. For the first time, the two forces of the human psyche become visible. Everything that follows will unfold as the story of their growing separation, their inevitable encounter, and their attempt to recover a lost unity. After the birth, the narrative makes an unexpected choice. It tells us almost nothing about how the brothers grew up. Nothing of their childhood, nothing of their games. The author's attention is fixed elsewhere, on showing how two different ways of being gradually begin to diverge. Esau becomes a man of the open country, a hunter, a man of immediate action. He lives in the present moment. His relationship with the world is almost entirely unmediated. He sees his goal and moves directly toward it. Jacob is described very differently. He remains among the tents. He watches. He waits. His strength lies not in the speed of action, but in the ability to foresee its consequences. If Esau changes the world through action, Jacob increasingly engages with it through consciousness. The ancient text does not yet judge these differences. It simply shows two paths slowly drifting apart. Then another detail appears, one that is often overlooked. Scripture tells us, Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. To the modern reader, it sounds almost like an ordinary family observation. Psychologically, however, the passage reaches much deeper. Each parent finds themselves drawn toward one of the two emerging poles. For the first time, the inner conflict of the individual receives reinforcement from the outside. The opposites do not merely exist anymore. They begin to strengthen. The next scene occupies only a few verses, yet it becomes the first true point of divergence. Esau returns from the hunt. He is exhausted. Before him stands a simple bowl of lentil stew. Jacob offers an exchange, the birthright, for a meal. The transaction itself requires little explanation. What matters is something far more profound. The ancient author places two completely different experiences of time side by side. For one brother, only the present moment exists. For the other, the future is already real. That is why the true object of the exchange is not the food itself. It is the willingness to surrender the future for the sake of the present, or conversely, to sacrifice the present for the sake of the future. If we read this episode as a psychological image, it becomes clear that the story is not about the greed of one brother, nor the carelessness of the other. It is our first encounter with two fundamentally different ways in which consciousness can be organized. One places complete trust in the immediacy of lived experience. The other is already capable of living in the light of what does not yet exist. Neither, however, is a complete personality. Each possesses a genuine strength, and each remains profoundly one-sided. Perhaps it is here that the ancient text first reveals one of the enduring characteristics of the human psyche. As long as consciousness has not yet learned to endure the tension between the present and the future, our decisions are not governed by understanding. They are governed by whatever impulse is strongest: hunger, fear, desire, anger. That is why so many of the decisions that shape a human life are made not in moments of clarity, but in moments of inner pressure. Only much later does consciousness begin to explain to itself why it acted as it did. One might even suggest that the ancient author is describing not the weakness of one brother, but a universal characteristic of the human psyche. Until consciousness learns to hold opposing forces together, its place will inevitably be taken by the strongest emotion. And then a person no longer lives according to what they understand, but according to what they happen to feel most intensely at that moment. The next event is familiar to everyone. Jacob receives the blessing that had been intended for Esau. But if we set aside questions of law, guilt, and justice, our attention is drawn to something altogether different. Before Jacob enters Isaac's presence, Rebekah covers his hands and the back of his neck with goatskins. The blind father must not see his son. He must recognize him by touch alone. Psychologically, this image is far more significant than the deception itself. The ancient author is not showing us a man who has become someone else. He is showing us a man who temporarily puts on the outward signs of another. It is one of the earliest archetypal images of human identity. Consciousness does not yet possess the qualities it needs, yet it already tries to make use of them as though they were its own. Not to develop them, not to live them, but to appropriate them. It is striking that Isaac almost immediately speaks the words that would become famous. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Perhaps it is here that one of the central themes of the entire story first emerges: the conflict between who we truly are and who we believe we must appear to be. The voice remains the same, only the outward form has changed. From a psychological perspective, this condition is deeply familiar. The personality often begins to rely on qualities that have not yet become its own. It puts on social roles, another person's confidence, another person's strength, another person's language. At times, this may be a necessary stage of psychological development. But when the outer mask begins to replace inner growth, tension inevitably begins to accumulate, and the ancient narrative will return to this theme again and again. Having received the blessing, Jacob is forced to leave his home. At first glance, the story appears to end in a remarkable victory. Psychologically, however, the opposite is true. Only now does the real journey begin. For once, the ego has separated itself from its opposite. It can no longer remain in the world it once knew. After his flight, Jacob is alone. His home lies behind him. His family lies behind him. The future is unknown. At this point, the ancient narrative unexpectedly slows its pace. It no longer speaks of people, no longer speaks of conflict. It does not even speak of God. It speaks only of a solitary man who has stopped for the night among the stones. Night falls. Jacob takes one of the stones and places it beneath his head. At first, the detail seems almost incidental, but ancient texts are rarely accidental. The stone becomes the only foundation between the man and the earth, the final point of support in a world that has suddenly ceased to feel familiar. It is here that one of the most celebrated episodes in the entire Bible unfolds. In his dream, Jacob sees a ladder stretching between earth and heaven. Angels ascend and descend upon it. The image is so simple that it can easily be reduced to a beautiful religious illustration. Yet perhaps something entirely different begins here. Edinger draws attention to one remarkable detail. The ladder does not appear when Jacob feels victorious, nor when he receives the blessing. It appears at the moment of absolute solitude, at the very point when the old life has already fallen away and the new one has not yet begun. From a psychological perspective, this is almost inevitable. As long as we remain completely absorbed in the familiar rhythms of life, we rarely feel compelled to search for a deeper foundation of our existence. But when the old foundation disappears, the psyche begins its search for a new one. And it is precisely then that the possibility first arises of encountering what Jung called the self, not as an idea, not as a philosophy, but as an inner reality immeasurably greater than the ego itself. When Jacob awakens, he speaks words of extraordinary simplicity. "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." There is no triumph in these words, no sense of being chosen, only the quiet shock of discovery. He realizes that reality has always been deeper than he imagined. It is not the world that has changed, it is his perception. Perhaps that is why Jacob's ladder has become one of the most enduring symbols in human culture. It is not merely a path from earth to heaven. It is the discovery that the bond between consciousness and the deeper source from which it arises is never completely lost. At times, we simply cease to notice it. The years pass. Jacob builds a family. He works. He prospers. He learns patience. He learns to wait. He learns how to live among other people. Yet what is truly remarkable is something else. The ancient narrative itself seems to lose interest in outward events. Entire decades pass almost unnoticed, because the greatest trial still lies ahead. At last, the day of return arrives. Ahead of him waits a meeting with the brother from whom he once had to flee. The text offers the detail almost casually. Esau is coming to meet him, and with him are 400 men. No one knows what is about to happen. Jacob begins to prepare. He divides his people into separate groups. He sends gifts ahead. He carefully considers every possible outcome. At first glance, it all appears to be the caution of an experienced man. Psychologically, however, something far more profound is taking place. A person may spend years changing the circumstances of their life, and yet, one day, they find themselves standing before the very thing from which they once walked away. Some encounters cannot be avoided. They can only be postponed. On the eve of that meeting, another mysterious scene unfolds. Jacob is left alone. Alone once again, just as he had been many years earlier, before the vision of the ladder. It is as though the ancient narrative deliberately removes every witness. For there are certain events that can take place only between a person and the deepest part of themselves. During the night, a stranger appears. The text never tells us who he is. A man, an angel, God himself. The narrative seems deliberately unwilling to resolve the mystery. The identity of the opponent is not what matters. What matters is that the struggle begins and continues until dawn. Edinger draws attention to one remarkable feature of this scene. Jacob does not receive his revelation through words. He receives it through resistance. Sometimes the deepest transformations do not occur when a person comes to understand something. They occur when they finally stop avoiding the inner struggle. The wrestling continues throughout the night. Neither side prevails. Neither side retreats. Then comes the moment that is impossible to forget. The stranger touches Jacob's hip. A single touch is enough. From that moment on, he will never walk as he once did. It is impossible to overlook the power of this image. A genuine encounter with the depths of one's own psyche never leaves a person unchanged. It does not make them perfect. It does not turn them into a hero. But after such an encounter, there is no returning to the life that came before. Something within has been changed forever. Only then does the question finally come. What is your name? At first, the answer seems obvious, yet it is this question that has become the most important of all. Jacob, not Israel, not the chosen one, not the victor. First, Jacob, a man who has lived through his entire story, a man with his fears, his deceptions, his flights, his losses, his night. Only then does the ancient story allow a new name to be spoken, not before, for no new name can be received until the old one has first been acknowledged. Perhaps that is why the ancient story asks this strange question only at the end of the night's struggle. What is your name? Not because the stranger does not know it, but because, for the first time, the man himself must speak it aloud. Not the new one, the old one. Perhaps our deepest encounters with ourselves do not begin when we discover something new. They begin when we stop denying who we have been. And perhaps that is why the new name comes only after the old one has been acknowledged, not instead of it, but because of it. Perhaps that is also why the ancient story remains silent for so long. It never explains how a new personality is born. It offers no psychological theory. It leaves us only an image. A man enters the night, acknowledges his name, his story, his shadow. And only then is he ready to step into the future, not to argue, not to surrender, but to accept and to receive a new name. Perhaps this is one of the deepest laws of the human psyche. The new is never born from denying the old. It is born from meeting it. And before we part, I would like to leave you with one question. What in your own story still remains unacknowledged? Perhaps it is there that the new name capable of changing your life has been waiting all along. If you found this reflection meaningful, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Until next time.